He came from the trees like a ghost, barefoot and shivering. "I don't know my own name," the boy whispered. The mountain man hadn't spoken in weeks until now. "From now on, you're my son." The scream wasn't loud. It wasn't even human, not at first. It was high and short and broken, like something caught between a sob and a howl. But Gideon Thorne heard it. He was halfway up a ridge when it pierced the cold morning air, made him stop with one boot on a rock and his breath steaming from his beard. For 3 days the old wolf hadn't made a sound. Neither had Gideon. Not since the last snowfall. Not since he buried the last man who'd come through these woods bleeding from the belly. But this sound, this cry, it cut through the trees like something not meant to be alone. Gideon dropped the pelt he was hauling and turned toward the sound. He moved fast for a man his size. Snow crunched underfoot, pine branches whipped at his shoulders, and his rifle stayed in his grip like an extension of his arm. The sound came again, closer now. A single cry, then silence, then the unmistakable rasp of something trying not to cry again. Gideon pushed through the brush and stopped dead. The boy stood barefoot in the snow, no more than 6 or 7 years old, his toes purple with cold and his ribs visible through a shirt that used to be white. A torn blanket was draped over his shoulders like a cape, and one of his eyes was nearly swollen shut. He flinched when he saw the rifle, then froze like an animal that had learned moving gets you hit harder. His lips trembled, but not from the cold. He started, voice hoarse, but the rest came out as a whisper Gideon had to lean in to catch. "I don't know my name." Gideon didn't move for a full second. His face was hard, unreadable, carved like stone beneath his beard. Then he knelt, slow and careful, setting the rifle gently in the snow. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice a gravel-low murmur. The boy's mouth opened, but nothing came, just a tear, then another, and then his knees gave out. He hit the snow without bracing and lay there shaking, like he didn't even have the strength left to cry right. Gideon scooped him up. The boy weighed less than a sack of oats. His body was warm, but barely, his breath shallow. He didn't resist, just tucked his head under Gideon's chin and clung to the rough wool of his coat like he'd been waiting for someone to hold him for longer than he could remember. Gideon didn't ask another question. He didn't waste words on comfort he didn't know how to give. He just turned and started walking. By the time they reached the cabin, the boy had gone silent again. The door groaned open on its hinges and warmth rushed out, wood smoke, the sharp tang of pine and the faint lingering scent of stew from 2 nights ago. Gideon stepped inside and kicked the door shut behind him. The cabin wasn't much. 1 room, a hearth, a bunk, a table, a few chairs, and shelves lined with preserved jars. But it was warm. It was safe. He laid the boy down near the fire and stripped off the wet blanket. There were marks on the child's back, old ones, faded like smoke stains, and newer ones too, thin and angry red. Rope maybe, or worse. Gideon's jaw worked once, then stilled. He went to the kettle, poured water into a tin mug, and knelt again. "Drink," he said. The boy took the cup with both hands. His fingers were small and raw. The water trembled with the shake in his grip, but he drank it down like he hadn't had a swallow in days. Gideon watched him, not a word, not a noise. "You remember anything?" he asked after a while. The boy shook his head. "Woke up in the woods, I think I ran. I think there was a house, but it was burning." He squinted. "I think someone screamed, but I don't know if it was me." Gideon said nothing, just reached behind him, pulled a quilt from the bed, and tucked it around the boy. "You'll rest here tonight." The boy blinked. "Do I got to go after?" "No." Silence again, then very softly. "Who are you?" Gideon stirred the fire, the light flickering across his worn face. "Name's Gideon Thorne. Folks used to call me Bear Man. Most just call me Gideon." "You live out here alone?" "I do." The boy's voice shook, not from cold now but from something deeper. "Why?" Gideon hesitated. Then he looked the boy in the eye. "Because the world out there forgot how to be kind. So I came where the trees still listen, and the wind don't lie." The boy didn't understand all of that, but he understood enough. He laid his head on the quilt and closed his eyes. That night Gideon didn't sleep. He sat by the fire sharpening his knife. He didn't need it sharp, not tonight, but the motion kept his hands busy, his mind clear. He didn't ask why a nameless boy had stumbled half-dead into his woods. He didn't ask what kind of people left rope marks on a child's back. He didn't need to. The next morning Gideon stepped outside, rifle in hand, eyes sweeping the woods. The storm had passed, but the sky was low and bruised. Tracks were faint but visible, boots, 3 pair, maybe 4, heading west. Not fresh, not more than a day or two old, but too close for comfort. He returned inside. The boy was still asleep. Small fingers clutched the quilt like it might disappear if he let go. Gideon sat at the table and began carving. A small piece of wood, nothing fancy, but his hands knew what to do. They always had. When the boy woke, he sat up slowly. "Is it morning?" "Sun's up," Gideon said without looking. The boy rubbed his eyes. "You got animals?" "Couple hens, mule, nothing worth stealing." The boy nodded, then after a moment, "You said your name was Gideon." "I did." The boy's voice was soft. "What should I call me?" Gideon paused. His hand stopped carving. He looked up, studied the child's face, the bruises, the weariness, the hope buried under layers of fear. "You can't remember nothing." The boy shook his head. Gideon set down the carving, walked over, and crouched. "Then we'll give you a name. You earn it day by day. You carry it like a knife on your belt, sharp and steady. And when you're ready, you keep it or trade it. That's how it works out here." The boy stared up at him, eyes wide. Gideon touched his shoulder. "From now on, you're my son." The words hung there, still and thick like fog. The boy opened his mouth, closed it again, then nodded. Outside, the wind picked up again, but it wasn't cruel this time, just cold. Gideon stood and handed him the carved figure, a bear, rough but strong. The boy clutched it to his chest like it was the only thing he owned. "You hungry?" Gideon asked. The boy nodded fast. Gideon smiled just barely. "Then let's feed you, bear." They spent the morning in quiet rhythm. Gideon split logs outside while Bear, what the boy answered to now without hesitation, sat on the porch steps with a bowl of oats, knees tucked under the 2 long sleeves of the coat Gideon had given him. The child didn't speak much, didn't fidget, didn't ask for things the way most boys might. He just sat still, eyes moving, watching the trees, watching the wind, watching Gideon, like he was trying to memorize everything in case it all vanished again. By midday, the snow had begun to melt in patches under the press of sun through thin clouds. It left the ground wet and dark and heavy. Gideon checked the traps west of the ridge while Bear walked a few paces behind, never straying far. They caught a rabbit and 2 squirrels, enough for stew that night. The boy didn't flinch at the blood, didn't wince when the knife worked through fur and sinew. He only asked once in a near whisper, "Did it hurt?" Gideon looked up, met his eyes. "No, fast and clean. That's the only way." Bear nodded, said nothing more. Back at the cabin, Gideon noticed something. The boy didn't ask to help, he just did. He gathered kindling without being told, fetched water from the creek without being asked. When one of the hens pecked his hand, he didn't cry, he just held his fingers to his mouth until the sting passed. He worked like someone who'd been punished for not working, who'd learned young that effort wasn't about praise but survival. Gideon didn't mention it, just watched. When night came, they ate slow. The fire cracked and spit behind them, and outside the darkness settled thick across the pines. Bear picked the carrots out of his bowl one by one, chewing in silence. Gideon let him. After, they sat near the hearth. Bear leaned his head against Gideon's leg, and the mountain man didn't move him away. He'd whittled another figure, this one a fox, and the boy turned it in his hand slowly, running his fingers along its sharp ears and pointed tail. "Was I always alone?" Bear asked suddenly. Gideon looked down at him. No one's always alone. But I don't remember anyone. Not a mama, not a brother, just dark and fire and running. Gideon didn't answer right away. He reached for the kettle, poured warm water into a tin cup, and handed it to the boy. Sometimes your mind hides things from you, he said finally. Things it ain't ready to remember yet, but that don't mean they're gone forever. Bear nodded and held the cup close. Do you remember when you were little? I remember enough, Gideon replied. Enough to know I ain't going back. The boy's voice turned soft. Did someone hurt you? Gideon didn't flinch, but the room cooled a little. He leaned back, shadows casting long across his face. Enough questions for tonight. Bear didn't press. But Gideon didn't sleep. Not really. He sat near the fire long after Bear had curled up in the quilt. Outside, something moved in the dark, just the trees settling maybe, or a raccoon on the roof. But his hand never strayed far from the rifle. He stared at the fire, at the boy, at the carved animals lined up along the shelf now like a little army. He didn't know what he'd invited in with this child. He only knew that the world didn't drop nameless boys at your door without a reason. The next morning came with a low sky and a strange quiet. No bird song, no wind, just stillness. Gideon felt it before he opened the door, a kind of pressure in his bones, a heaviness he'd learned not to ignore. He stepped onto the porch, boots hitting wood like warning drums. Bear followed behind, barefoot again. He never wore the boots for long, said they made him feel slow. Gideon crouched by the edge of the porch and brushed snow from a set of tracks, too large to be Bear's, too fresh to be his own. They'd been there before dawn, close to the cabin, watching. He stood slowly. Inside, he said, voice flat. Bear obeyed without question. Gideon didn't rush. He didn't panic. He just moved, pulled down the rifle, checked the chamber, set it near the door. Then he pulled the small pistol from under the floorboard and tucked it into his coat. By midday, nothing came, but Gideon didn't relax. He paced the perimeter twice, checked every tree line, every slope, every shadow. He returned with a tight jaw and a loaded stare. Inside, Bear was sitting at the table, tracing shapes into the wood with his finger. Someone's been here, he said quietly, not asking. Gideon nodded. More than one. Will they come back? They will. Why? Gideon sat down hard, the chair creaking under his weight. Because the world don't like to let go of what it thinks it owns. The boy thought on that. That evening the storm returned. Not snow this time, but sleet, sharp as nails. It rattled the windows and turned the roof into a drum. Bear stood near the fire, watching the flames flicker. You ever been shot? He asked suddenly. Gideon raised an eyebrow. You ask a lot of questions. You said not to ask about you, so I'm asking about bullets. Gideon took a long breath. Yes, once in the leg. Did it hurt? Yes. Did you shoot back? Gideon met the boy's eyes. Yes. Bear nodded slowly. I think I saw someone get shot, a woman. I think she had yellow hair. She tried to pick me up and then there was red, and then she stopped moving. Gideon's face didn't change, but his chest rose once, deep and slow. You remember her face? Bear shook his head. Just the yellow and a necklace. It had a bird on it. Gideon said nothing, but he reached into a drawer and pulled out an old journal. The pages were yellowed and cracked at the edges. He flipped through until he found a blank one, then handed it to Bear. Draw it. Bear blinked. What? The bird. Draw what you remember. I don't know how to draw. Doesn't matter, try. So Bear did. His hands trembled and the lines were rough, unsure, but something came out. A shape, wings, a circle. Gideon studied it in silence. Then he took the journal and tucked it back into the drawer without a word. That night he cleaned both rifles, set one beside the door, set the other under his bedroll. In the morning, there was smoke on the eastern horizon. Just a thin line, too far to smell, but Gideon knew. Someone was burning something, a signal maybe, or a search party. Either way, it was coming closer. He didn't tell Bear, not yet. Instead, he taught him how to load the pistol, how to chamber a round, how to aim. Bear's hands were small, but they didn't shake. "Don't point it unless you mean it," Gideon said, "and don't shoot unless you got no other choice." Bear nodded. "Would you ever shoot someone who came for me?" The question came sudden, hard. Gideon didn't hesitate. Yes. Even if it was someone you knew. Especially then. Bear didn't speak for a while. Then he walked to the shelf and picked up the bear carving, held it close. That night the wind changed direction. It carried with it the faint scent of ash. Gideon didn't sleep. And outside, past the ridge, firelight flickered behind the trees. The fire was far, but not far enough. Gideon watched it through narrowed eyes, standing at the edge of the tree line just beyond the ridge. The flicker was faint, orange lapping at the cold horizon, but steady like someone had built it for signal, not warmth. He counted 3 figures from his position, maybe 4, hard to tell. They weren't moving much, just standing near the flame, pacing occasionally, one of them pulling something from a satchel, a map, a sketch. Gideon didn't get close enough to see. He turned back before the sun crested the trees. When he returned to the cabin, Bear was waiting on the porch, the pistol tucked beneath both arms like a precious secret. He looked up, eyes wide and quiet. "You saw them," Bear said softly. It wasn't a question. "I did. Are they coming?" "Soon enough." The boy didn't tremble. He just sat there, cradling the weapon, the bear carving tucked in the pocket of his too large coat. Gideon felt a strange knot in his chest, something like pride, but threaded with sorrow. No boy should have to know the weight of survival this early. No boy should look at a man like Gideon and see safety, because the world had stripped away every other kind. They spent the rest of the day in preparation. Gideon moved with methodical precision, securing the cabin in practiced silence. The windows were shuttered and nailed tight. The woodpile inside was stacked near the hearth. The shelves were cleared of jars and dishes, anything that might fall, break, or make noise when it mattered. Bear followed him like a shadow, helping where he could, never asking why. At the end of it, Gideon laid out the rifles and ammunition on the table. "How many?" Bear asked. 4, maybe 5. Don't know if they'll all come." "Are they bad men?" Gideon hesitated. "They're men who want something. Usually that's worse." Bear nodded slowly. "Do you think they're looking for me?" Gideon looked him over. The bruises had faded, but the boy still walked like someone afraid of sudden sounds. His ribs still showed when he stretched. He flinched sometimes, even when no one moved. "I think they've been looking for you for a long time." That night the storm came again. Not snow this time, but rain, cold and steady, soaking the earth in a miserable slop. Gideon sat near the window, watching. Bear curled in the chair beside the hearth, one eye open, like he didn't trust the fire not to vanish if he blinked too long. Then, just after midnight, the knock came. It was quiet, deliberate. Not the frantic hammering of a man desperate, not the scraping plea of someone freezing. Just 3 soft knocks. Bear sat up straight, his eyes went wide. Gideon raised one hand without turning. "Stay." The rifle was already beside him. He stood and moved toward the door. Another knock, a little firmer now. "Name yourself," Gideon called out. Silence. Then a voice, a smooth drawl too calm to be friendly. "Evening, we ain't looking for trouble, just chasing someone wandered off. Small thing, quiet, might not even know his name." Bear's breath hitched. Gideon could hear it from across the room. The voice continued. "Boy's confused, belongs with us. His family's worried sick." Gideon said nothing. "You got a child in there. Cold night for one to be alone." Gideon finally spoke. "Ain't alone." A pause, then the voice sharpened just a fraction. "We mean to have a look around." No, Gideon replied. We weren't asking. That's your mistake. A beat, then footsteps, at least 2 sets crunching around the side of the cabin. Gideon turned to Bear. Back room, stay low, take the pistol. You see someone come through that back window, don't wait. Bear nodded once and vanished into the shadows like he'd done it before. The first window shattered a second later. Gideon didn't flinch. He raised the rifle and fired once clean and sharp. A cry rang out, muffled by the rain. Someone fell hard against the wall. Another figure darted past the front, moving toward the back. Gideon crossed the room in 3 long strides. He kicked the side table down to block the door and dropped behind the second window. Another shadow moved. Crack, another shot, another scream. Then the back of the cabin exploded in sound. Not gunfire, not yelling. Silence. Then a scream, high and broken. Gideon's blood ran cold. He turned, rifle raised, and kicked open the door to the back room. Bear was on the floor, pistol in both hands, arms shaking. A man lay across the threshold, clutching his stomach, blood soaking into the floorboards. He was older, gray at the temples, but strong. Or had been. He came through the window, Bear whispered, eyes wide with terror. He said he knew my name. He said my real name was Nathaniel. Gideon knelt, pried the pistol gently from Bear's hands, and wrapped his arms around him. He's wrong, Gideon murmured. Your name's Bear, that's the name you earned. Outside, the storm began to slow. Footsteps retreated. One of the men cursed into the night, dragging one of the wounded with him. Gideon didn't chase them. He just held the boy until the shaking stopped. By dawn, the bodies had cooled. 2 men dead, 1 wounded, 1 vanished. Bear didn't sleep. He just sat near the fire, clutching the pistol with both hands, the bear carving beside him. Did I kill him? He asked as the morning light crept through the window. No, Gideon said gently. He was dead long before he crawled through that window. Bear looked at him. Then what did I do? You stopped him. The boy nodded slowly. Then he set the pistol down. I remember something else, he said softly. There was a house, white walls, big, lots of voices. A woman used to tell me not to cry when they came for me. She said it was better if I didn't fight. Gideon's hands curled into fists. She said if I ran, they'd just find me and punish me worse. I think I ran anyway. You did good, Gideon said. You ran far enough. Bear turned toward the window. Do you think they'll come again? Gideon followed his gaze. The ridge was still. The smoke was gone. They always do, he said. But now they'll know we're not waiting with open arms. Later that afternoon, they buried the bodies deep in the pines. Gideon said no words over the graves. Neither did Bear. They just stood there, the cold soaking into their boots, the quiet wrapping around them like fog. Back at the cabin, Gideon cleaned the bloodstains while Bear chopped kindling. The world hadn't gotten safer, but something in Bear had shifted. He didn't flinch when the fire popped. He didn't ask where Gideon was every 5 minutes. He stood straighter, walked steadier. That night, after stew and silence, Gideon handed him a new carving. A wolf. It's for when you're ready, Gideon said. You keep it when you feel like you earned it. Bear studied it carefully, then tucked it into the pocket beside the bear. I'll earn it, he said quietly, even if it takes a long time. Gideon gave a slow nod. You already are. The week that followed passed like a slow breath, measured and tense but not without warmth. The snow melted in waves, pooling in the roots of pines and rushing down the slopes like the mountains were bleeding out winter. The world thawed, and with it, Bear began to speak more. Not much, never more than he needed, but the silence between them no longer felt brittle. It had settled into something solid, like trust. Gideon taught the boy how to snare rabbits, how to listen to the wind and know if it meant weather or warning, how to gut fish with 2 fingers and a calm mind. Bear learned fast, too fast maybe. His hands were small but precise, and he didn't hesitate with a blade, not out of joy or thrill, but out of necessity. He understood early that hesitation left you cold and hungry. Hesitation could get you killed. Still, there were cracks in him. Moments when the child he was peeked through the man he was being forced to become. Like the morning he found a broken locket beneath the floorboards, something Gideon hadn't known was there. It had no picture, just a bit of cloth inside, faded and yellowed. Bear clutched it in his fist for half the day, never saying a word about it. When Gideon asked, the boy only said, "I think someone gave it to me, before everything." Later that night, Bear slept with it in his palm, curled tight like it would vanish if he let go. The danger didn't return right away. No more fires on the ridgeline, no more figures circling the cabin, but Gideon knew better than to believe they were safe. The men who'd come weren't the type to give up after one bad night, especially not if there was money involved, or secrets. He could feel it like a storm beyond the hills, just out of sight, still brewing. He sent a message down the valley, an old trapper named Jonas who passed through twice each season. The man owed Gideon a favor and had sharp enough eyes to spot trouble before it bloomed. Gideon handed him a letter scratched in tight ink and paid him in smoked meat and a bottle of rye. Jonas didn't ask questions, just tipped his hat and vanished into the trees. 2 days later, Bear asked what was in the letter. "An inquiry," Gideon said, "about your name, your real one." Bear went quiet. "I thought you said I could keep Bear." "You can, but I figured if someone out there is still waiting for a boy with your eyes and quiet heart, they ought to know he's alive." Bear stared at the fire. "What if they're bad people?" "Then we keep walking." "But what if they're not?" "Then we decide if they're worth knowing." That night thunder rolled across the sky, not from a storm but from memory. Bear woke screaming, the sound raw and torn from somewhere deep. Gideon had him wrapped in his arms before the boy could open his eyes. He thrashed once, twice, then stilled, his face pressed to Gideon's chest. "I saw it," he whispered. "I saw the house. I saw her again. She was holding me." "Your mother?" Gideon asked. "I think so. She had long hair, black like coal. She smelled like cedar. She was running with me through fire, but someone grabbed her. They yanked me away and I couldn't. His voice broke. Gideon didn't shush him, didn't say it would be all right. He just held him tighter. When morning came, Bear didn't speak of it again. But he didn't let go of the locket, not even while chopping wood or setting traps. 3 days passed, then 5, and then Jonas returned. He came at dusk, boots muddy, beard full of pine needles, his eyes drawn tight. He didn't ride, didn't whistle, just appeared at the edge of the clearing like a ghost. Gideon met him on the porch. "What did you find?" Jonas handed him a crumpled sheet of parchment. "Town east of here, 3 days' ride. Sheriff had a poster, not a bounty, just a missing child notice. Name was Josiah, age 7, brown hair, brown eyes, last seen near Lake Marlin. Parents reported dead, house fire, some talk of trafficking ring operating in the area. Burned the place to the ground to cover it up. The boy vanished." Gideon read it once, then again, then looked up. "Was there a picture?" Jonas nodded. "Rough sketch, close enough." Gideon's face didn't move, but his eyes did. He turned toward the cabin. Bear was watching from the window. That night they sat at the table, the paper between them. Bear stared at the name for a long time. "Josiah," he whispered. "You remember it?" Gideon asked. The boy nodded slowly. "It feels heavy, but right." "You don't have to take it back." "I want to." Gideon reached for the paper, folded it gently. "Then Josiah it is." Bear, Josiah, breath deep, like someone who'd finally found the air he'd been missing. But the peace didn't last. The next morning Gideon found fresh tracks near the creek, horse prints, wagon ruts, deep and recent. He followed them east until he saw the smoke. A homestead, burned down, still smoldering. Bodies in the yard, 2 adults, a child. He buried them in silence, marked the graves with stone. Whoever did it had moved fast, clean, no looting, just fire and death. When he returned to the cabin, Josiah was waiting on the porch. "You found something," the boy said. Gideon nodded. "More ghosts." Josiah didn't ask questions. He just said, "We should be ready." So they were. That night Gideon packed supplies, enough for a week: rifles, rope, maps, food. He taught Josiah how to follow stars, how to move without sound, how to read animal signs and listen for changes in the forest's rhythm. And then, as the moon climbed high, the boy looked up and asked, "Are we running again?" Gideon crouched beside him. "We're moving forward, not running." "But why now?" "Because we can't wait for evil to come back knocking. Sometimes you have to find where it sleeps and end it before it wakes." Josiah's eyes hardened. "Then let's go." Gideon saw it in him then, the shift from hunted to hunter, the quiet fire behind his ribs, the steadiness of someone who knew what it was to be forgotten but chose not to stay invisible. The next morning they set off. South toward Lake Marlin, toward whatever truth was buried in fire and silence. As they crossed the first ridge, Josiah looked back only once. Then he set his jaw and walked forward, a carving in one pocket and a pistol in the other. And for the first time in a long time, Gideon Thorne didn't feel alone. They moved through the valley like shadows, sticking to game trails and forgotten paths, miles from any stage route or telegraph line. Gideon led without speaking much, but Josiah didn't need words. He had learned how to read the mountain man's movements, how pause meant danger, a nod meant move, and the set of Gideon's jaw meant questions would have to wait. They made camp in ravines, behind rock walls, in lean-tos hidden beneath overhangs that smelled of old moss and bare musk. Josiah never complained. Not about the cold, not about the wet, not even about the bruises on his feet from too small boots and too long hikes. He moved with the quiet steadiness of someone who knew survival wasn't about comfort. It was about endurance. On the fourth night, the stars were clear above a low canyon, and the wind had quieted to a breath. Gideon sat sharpening his knife while Josiah turned the last of the salted rabbit over the fire. "You ever been to Lake Marlin?" the boy asked. Gideon didn't look up. "Once, long time ago, nothing but sawmills and sorrow. Folks came there to forget or to make others disappear." Josiah nodded, turning the meat carefully. "Do you think they're still there, the ones who burned my house?" "I think fire like that doesn't go out unless someone puts it out, and I don't think anyone's tried yet." The boy stared into the flames. "Then we're going to end it." Gideon met his eyes across the fire. "We're going to make sure no other child ends up like you." Josiah turned back to the flames, but his hands had stilled. They reached the outskirts of Lake Marlin 2 days later. The trees thinned, the land flattened, and the river ran wide and fast, dragging half-thawed ice downstream like lost teeth. The town lay on the southern bank, wooden buildings clinging to the mud, most of them low and crooked from time and hard weather. A general store, a boarding house, a saloon with a split sign, and at the far end a sheriff's office barely larger than a stable. But it wasn't the buildings that drew Gideon's eye. It was the people. Men loitered on porches, boots up, coats open despite the cold. Their eyes tracked movement like hawks. A few women drifted by, faces hard, most avoiding eye contact. Children ran between buildings, but not with joy. Their laughter was short, brittle. Gideon had seen towns like this before, where fear was law and silence kept you breathing. They entered the town on foot, no horses, no baggage save for Gideon's satchel and Josiah's coat stuffed with wood carvings and a worn journal. The boy stayed close, his hand brushing the handle of the pistol in his pocket. They walked into the general store first. An old man stood behind the counter, white beard stained with tobacco, eyes squinting beneath yellowed brows. "Help you?" he asked. "Looking for work," Gideon said simply. "Something honest, short-term." The old man grunted. "Ain't much honest left in Marlin." Then I'll take what passes for it. The man stared at him a long moment, then jerked his chin. Mill.'s always hiring, down by the river, or the boarding house. Miss Evelyn needs someone to split wood. Her knees are gone. Gideon nodded. Appreciate it. They left without buying anything. Outside, Josiah spoke low. That man behind the counter, he kept looking at me. I know. Like he knew me. I know. They walked toward the mill, passing the sheriff's office. A thin man in a brown duster leaned in the doorway, chewing on a splinter of wood. He watched them go by with that same flat stare Gideon had seen in Bounty Men and Gravediggers. At the mill, Gideon took a short job stacking lumber, fast work, paid in coin, no questions. Josiah sat nearby, pretending to sketch in the dirt with a stick but really watching, listening. When the sun dipped low, they found a spot outside of town, just beyond the tree line, where a few ruined foundations marked where cabins once stood. No one came there anymore. Gideon set up camp and they ate quietly. That night Josiah opened his journal and showed Gideon a sketch. It was rough, child's hands, faint lines, but clear enough. That man at the sheriff's office, Josiah said. I think I've seen him before. Gideon took the drawing. The jaw was sharp, the eyes narrow. He the one who took you. Josiah shook his head. No, but he was there, at the house. I think he was talking to someone, arguing. You remember what about? Something about payment, about not asking questions. Gideon set the journal down. The next day, Gideon went back into town alone. Left Josiah with a knife and clear instructions. Where to hide, when to run, what sound meant trouble. The boy nodded without flinching. Gideon visited the saloon, bought a drink he didn't touch, listened to men talk. The name Sheriff Baird came up more than once. No one spoke it with warmth. By midday, Gideon had what he needed. Sheriff Baird had taken over the badge 5 years ago after the last man vanished in the river. No one voted. No one objected. He was just there, and then he stayed. Word was he kept the peace, so long as you didn't look too close at who got to sleep with both eyes shut. When Gideon returned to camp, Josiah was gone. The fire was cold, the tracks were fresh. Boots 3 pairs. Gideon moved like a storm through the brush, silent and fast, his rifle slung across his back. He followed the prints west, toward the boarding house. But they curved before they reached town, diving into an old barn behind the blacksmith's lot. He crouched outside, listened. Voices, 2 men, and a boy crying. Josiah. Gideon kicked the door open with enough force to split the frame. One man turned, shocked. The other reached for his pistol. Gideon shot him first, clean through the shoulder. He dropped screaming. The other froze. Step back, Gideon said. The man obeyed. Josiah was bound at the ankles, hands tied behind his back, a bruise blooming beneath one eye. His mouth was gagged with a strip of cloth. Gideon crossed the room, cut him loose. Didn't mean no harm, the unshot man stammered. Just following orders. Whose? Baird said the boy was property. Said he'd escaped from some house down south, paid good money to have him back. Gideon stared at him. He's a child. The man's face crumpled. It ain't my business, he pays well. Not anymore. They left the man tied up beside his friend, bleeding and whimpering. Gideon carried Josiah out into the light, set him down gently. The boy didn't cry. I tried to fight, he whispered. I kicked one in the knee. You did good. They said they were gonna put me in a wagon, take me back to a place called Red Hollow. Gideon's stomach turned. He'd heard of Red Hollow, a home for wayward children, run by men who never let reporters inside. Kids disappeared from there like water through cracks. We're not letting that happen. Josiah gripped his coat. I want to stop them, Gideon, all of them, not just the sheriff. I want to make sure no one else gets taken. The mountain man nodded once. Then we start tonight. The sun dipped behind the hills like it was trying to disappear before nightfall. Gideon knew that kind of retreat. He'd seen men flinch the same way when darkness promised violence. But he and Josiah weren't hiding. Not anymore. They waited just past the edge of town, crouched in the hollows beneath a twisted pine, the lanterns of Lake Marlin blinking through the mist ahead like watchful eyes. Sheriff Baird hadn't sounded the alarm yet, but word was already moving, quick, hushed, and dirty. The 2 men Gideon had left in the barn wouldn't be found till morning. By then it'd be too late. If they moved right, tonight would change everything. Gideon laid the rifle across his lap and checked the chamber by touch. Josiah sat beside him, staring into the dark with a steadiness that didn't belong to a boy his age. The bruise on his face had deepened to purple, but his jaw didn't tremble. "You sure?" Gideon asked, voice low. Josiah nodded. "If we wait, someone else will be taken, might already be." Gideon didn't argue. He respected silence more than words, and Josiah had already said what needed saying. Their plan was simple. Get inside the sheriff's office, find the ledgers, find the names, burn everything else. Expose it all. The darkness helped them. Most of the town slept early, buried beneath whiskey, wind, and whatever guilt they'd learned to ignore. The boardwalks creaked beneath their feet, but no one came out. The windows were shut, curtains drawn, dogs didn't even bark. They reached the sheriff's office just past midnight. Gideon tried the door, locked of course, but the side window was loose. Josiah slipped in first, feet landing quiet on the floorboards inside. Then he opened the door for Gideon, who ducked in and closed it gently behind him. The office smelled of sweat, tobacco, and old ink. A single oil lamp flickered on the desk, left burning like the sheriff didn't want to forget who he was. The back room held the holding cell, empty now, but across from it, stacked neatly in a filing cabinet and locked drawer, were the records. Gideon picked the lock in silence. Old bounty skills, rusty but still sharp enough. The drawer slid open with a soft clack. Inside were papers, dozens, maybe hundreds. Ledger entries, names, ages, descriptions, dates, payments, destinations. Josiah leaned in. He didn't speak, but his hand trembled as it hovered over the pages. Then he pointed to one near the bottom. "That's me." Gideon read the line. Subject Josiah Carter. Age 7. Asset code Sparrow. Transfer approved to Red Hollow. Final payment received $500. Josiah's name. His real name, not just Bear, not just a child lost in the woods. This was the proof. He'd been sold. But there were more names. Sarah Brenner, age 6, transfer Red Hollow. Emmett Lorne, age 5, transfer Whitendale. Eva Cormack, age 8, transfer Red Hollow. Subject unknown female, age approx. 4, listed nonverbal, transfer failed. It went on and on, dozens, maybe more, some crossed out, some marked recovered. Others listed only by numbers and prices, no faces, just children treated like crates of freight. Josiah didn't cry, but Gideon could see the fury working through his jaw. The boy's lips were pressed into a thin, bloodless line, and his fists were clenched so hard the knuckles showed white. "We burn it," he said. Gideon nodded. "We do." But not yet. Gideon took one page, Josiah's, and folded it into his coat. The rest he doused in lamp oil, lit with a match, and dropped into the drawer. The flame hissed, then caught with a low roar. The paper blackened, curled, and turned to ash. They were halfway to the door when it burst open. Sheriff Baird stood there, pistol raised. Behind him, 3 men, guns drawn, boots stomping like they meant to tear the floor out from under them. The fire behind Gideon cast their shadows long and monstrous. "Well now," Baird drawled, "ain't this a picture?" Josiah stepped behind Gideon, but not far, not hiding. "You come for the truth?" Baird asked, raising one brow. "Or for the blood?" Truth already spoke, Gideon said. Baird smirked. You think anyone in this town's gonna miss a few sheets of paper? Think burning ledgers changes what built this place? Gideon's voice stayed even. No, but it's a start. The sheriff's gun cocked. But he wasn't fast enough. Josiah drew first. The pistol barked. Baird staggered back, roaring in pain as the bullet tore through his shoulder. He dropped his weapon. Gideon moved instantly, firing twice, one man down, another spun and crashed into a wall. The third ran. Josiah stood there panting, pistol still raised, hand shaking. Gideon put a hand on his shoulder. You shot him, he said. Josiah looked up. I meant to. Gideon didn't speak, just nodded. Baird groaned on the floor, hand clutched to his shoulder, blood seeping through his coat. You don't know what you're messing with, he spat. Red Hollow's got men in every town. They'll come for you. You think this ends with me? No, Gideon said. It ends when there's nothing left to come for. They didn't kill Baird. Not then. Josiah wouldn't have flinched, but Gideon wanted him alive long enough to watch the fire spread. They dragged him to the middle of town, tied him to the water tower with a sign across his chest. Child thief. Then Gideon rang the bell. The town woke slow. Lights flickered on, doors opened. People stepped out squinting, yawning, mumbling. They saw the sheriff. They saw the blood. And then they saw the boy standing beside Gideon, face bruised, eyes clear, pistol in hand. This man sold children, Gideon said, voice rising over the cold morning air. Your children, not strangers, yours. Someone gasped. A woman stepped forward, hand to her mouth. Another man cursed under his breath. Gideon dropped the ledger page onto the dirt. It landed face up. Josiah's name, his age, his price. Then he lit the rest of the records, right there in the street. The fire caught fast. No one moved to stop him. Baird screamed through the gag, eyes wild, but no one came to his aid. By sunrise, the town had split in two. Some walked away. Some stayed, stared into the flames. Some cried. A few clutched their own children a little tighter. Gideon and Josiah didn't wait. They were gone before noon, heading west toward Red Hollow. Because now it wasn't just about survival. It was war. The road west felt colder than it should have, though spring had begun to stir in the wind. Green buds clung stubbornly to the ends of branches, and birdsong had returned to the hills, tentative and uncertain like everything else. But Gideon and Josiah kept moving with the quiet gravity of men marching to a place they could not turn back from. Red Hollow wasn't marked on any map. It was the kind of place whispered about in dry saloons and passed between bounty hunters like poison. Not a town, not even a camp, just a place built from timber and secrets, tucked deep in the crooked edge of a valley no honest traveler had reason to enter. They followed the river for 2 days, skirting abandoned tracks and rusted rails. Josiah walked steady, no longer needing reminders about foot placement or pacing. His bruises had faded, but his eyes had not softened. He asked fewer questions now, but when he did, they cut deep. Do you think the other kids, the ones from the ledger, are still alive? Gideon looked over his shoulder at him. Some. And if they're not, then we bury the dead and save the rest. Josiah nodded and kept walking. They crossed the old hanging bridge by dawn on the 3rd day. It groaned beneath their weight but held. On the other side, the trees thickened, darker here. The moss grew heavy on the trunks, and the soil turned to black loam that soaked sound and swallowed boot prints. By noon they found it. A tall wooden fence, more like a stockade, ran a jagged line through the trees with watchtowers at either end manned by quiet figures in dust-colored coats. Beyond it, timber buildings rose in sharp lines, uniform, square, soulless. The roofs were flat, the windows small. A school, a dormitory, a kitchen, a longhouse, and in the center, a building taller than the rest with iron bars on the windows and a bell at its peak. No sign. No nameplate. But Gideon knew what it was. Josiah stared at it with the stillness of a hunted thing recognizing its trap. He didn't speak, didn't blink. He just clenched his jaw and waited. Gideon pulled him back into the trees, crouched behind a fallen log, and laid out the map. There, he said, pointing. Supply cart path, we'll use it to get close. You think we can get in without them seeing? Not planning to sneak, Gideon said. We walk in like we belong. Josiah looked up at him. And if they know our faces? Then we give them something to be afraid of. That night the storm came back. Not rain, thunder, distant but constant like a warning drum in the sky. Gideon and Josiah crept down the cart path, cloaked in black coats and quiet steps. They passed the fence where a guard stood smoking, rifle slung lazy across his shoulder. He didn't notice them, not yet. They waited in the hollow until morning. Then, as the sun rose pale and uncertain through the trees, they moved. No sneaking, no running. Just walked straight up to the front gate. The guards didn't know what to do. One shouted, the other raised a weapon. Gideon didn't flinch. He raised his hands, open, visible. Josiah stood beside him, calm. We're here to speak to the director, Gideon called. The guards hesitated. Then from the tall building, a man emerged. He was lean, gray-haired, with a face like bleached leather and hands too clean for a place like this. He wore a black coat and gloves, and his eyes glinted like polished steel. You've got nerve, he said, voice mild but sharp. Gideon stepped forward. You've got a problem. The director didn't blink. Do I know you? You know my work, Gideon replied. The man studied Josiah. And you? I'm not yours, the boy said. The director chuckled. Children are like property. Unclaimed, they default to the state, and this place is the state. Not anymore, Gideon said. Your sheriff in Marlin's been exposed. Your record's burned. The law's coming and they'll want names. The director didn't react. Instead, he nodded to the guards. Take them to the holding room. The rifles came up. Josiah tensed, hand near his coat. Gideon gave a slight shake of his head. Not yet. They were led inside through the tall doors, past rooms lined with bunks and frightened eyes. Children peeked through cracks in the walls, small and pale and silent. Some clutched toys, others held each other. No one smiled. They were locked in a bare room. Stone floor, wood walls, barred window too high to reach. Josiah sat on the floor, back against the wall. Now what? He asked. Now, Gideon said, we wait for our noise to reach the right ears. They're going to hurt us. They'll try. Josiah reached into his coat and pulled out the carving bear in one hand, wolf in the other. I don't want to be scared anymore, he said. You're not, Gideon replied. They sat in silence until the door opened again. A new man entered, heavier, red-faced, with a long scar across one brow. He looked them over like cattle. The director says we got no use for you, he said, so we'll bury you quiet and call it a runaway. Josiah stood. I remember you, he said. The man sneered. You don't remember nothing, runt. You had a ring with a green stone. You took it off to hit me. The man blinked just once, then reached for his belt. But Gideon was faster. He'd waited for this, waited with the patience of wolves in winter. The knife came out like lightning. It hit the man in the thigh. He howled and staggered back. Josiah lunged for the keys on his belt and ripped them free. Gideon followed, slammed the door shut, and locked it from the outside. They ran. Through the halls, past children staring, stunned, too frightened to move. Help us, Josiah shouted. We're leaving, you can come. Some blinked, some followed. One girl clutched Josiah's sleeve. She was barefoot and silent, but her eyes were sharp. Gideon kicked open the door to the director's office. Papers flew, files, names. He grabbed them all. They poured kerosene across the floor. The director stormed in, pistol raised. "You're condemning them all," he snarled. "No," Gideon said, "we're freeing them." He lit the match. The fire roared to life, swallowing the room whole. Children poured out of the buildings now, dozens of them. Some crying, some silent. The guards didn't shoot, they backed off, confused, outnumbered. Gideon and Josiah led the march to the trees. Flames reached high behind them, painting the valley in orange and ash. No one followed. Not that day. Not ever again. The fire burned through the night. It danced along the rooftops like a living thing, devouring the timbers of Red Hollow one building at a time. Smoke curled high into the dark sky, thick and bitter, blotting out the stars. Somewhere beyond the flames, a bell rang once, then fell silent as its tower collapsed under its own weight. Sparks rained through the trees, but no one turned back to look. They walked in silence, 43 children in total, their faces lit by flickering firelight behind them, most of them barefoot. Some carried scraps of clothing or stolen blankets. A few held hands, others walked alone, their shoulders squared in a way no child should be. No one cried, not yet. The terror had buried itself too deep for tears. Josiah stayed near the front, moving alongside Gideon. The girl with the sharp eyes and bare feet, Myra, walked beside him, never saying a word. She carried a wooden spoon like a weapon. She never let it go. It wasn't until they reached the creek, 3 miles from the blaze, that anyone stopped moving. Gideon motioned to the children, "Here." They settled on the banks like birds too tired to fly. Some sat in huddled clusters, others laid back on the cold earth, staring up at nothing. Josiah stood beside a tree, staring back toward the smoke still twisting through the pines. "It's over," he whispered. Gideon shook his head. "This part is." Josiah looked up. "Then what now?" "We get them safe. Then we make sure it never happens again." The boy took a long breath, and for a moment he looked younger again. His shoulders drooped slightly. He leaned against the tree and slid down until he was sitting in the dirt, arms around his knees. A few hours later, the first riders came. 3 men, cautious and slow, weapons drawn but held low. One wore a badge worn, crooked, honest. A real lawman from the county seat, not one bought and paid for. Gideon stepped forward as the children stirred. "We've come for them," the man said, voice gruff but not unkind. "Got a telegram. Said there was a place in the valley, a place stealing children." Gideon nodded. There was. "And now?" "It's gone." The sheriff dismounted, removed his hat and looked around. The children watched him with wary eyes. "What's your name, son?" he asked Josiah gently. The boy hesitated, then he stood. "Josiah Carter," he said, "but you can call me Bear." The sheriff blinked. "You're the one who sent the sketch." Josiah nodded. "Folks thought it was made up, a story." "It was real," the boy said, "all of it." The sheriff looked to Gideon. "We'll take M, get M fed, housed the honest way." "You better," Gideon said, "because if another Red Hollow rises, I'll come back down from the mountains, and I won't be alone." The sheriff nodded slowly, understood. It took 3 days to sort the names, to match children with what little family could be found. Some had homes waiting, others didn't. Those ones stayed close to Josiah, clung to him like his silence meant safety. Myra never left his side. When the wagons came to take them to the county shelter, Josiah stood beside Gideon, watching. "You're not coming?" he asked. Gideon crouched beside him. "You don't need me there." "Yes, I do." The mountain man smiled, a rare, slow thing that didn't reach his eyes but warmed the air between them. "You'll have food, a bed, a chance to be a child again." "I don't want to be a child," Josiah said. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen again." Gideon reached into his coat, pulled out the journal, the one with the sketches, the names, the truth. You keep this, keep writing, keep drawing, keep remembering." Josiah took it, holding it close. "And when you're ready," Gideon added, "come find me. I'll be where the pines still grow thick and the wind still sings." Josiah nodded. His lip trembled once. Then he threw his arms around Gideon's neck and held him tight. The hug lasted a long time. When the wagon wheels finally began to turn, Josiah climbed up, his eyes never leaving the tree line where Gideon disappeared. The other children whispered, pointing at the boy who started the fire, the boy who broke the silence, the boy who gave them back their names. Weeks passed. Then months. Letters began to arrive, from county officials, from newly formed committees, from families reunited. They all said the same thing because of him. And one letter, written in a child's hand, made its way up the mountain. It read, "I remember her now, my mama. Her name was Clara. She used to braid my hair before bed and sing the song about the river that never stops moving. I sing it now to the others when they're scared. They say I'm like you. I think that's good. I hope I earned the wolf carving. Bear." Gideon read it twice. Then he took the carving from the shelf, ran a thumb across its rough grain, and tucked it into a satchel along with food, a compass, and one carved bear. He stepped out into the cold morning light, the valley stretching before him. Somewhere down there, a boy with a carved spoon and a fire in his chest was waiting. Gideon Thorne shouldered his pack and walked toward him. "Can't sleep otherwise." "Then we don't sleep." Josiah reached into the pack on his back and placed something on the table between them. "The wolf carving. I think I've earned it now," he said. Gideon picked it up, ran a thumb across the bottom where Josiah had carved his own initials beneath Gideon's original mark. He nodded once, slow. "I think you have." That night the storm rose high. The windows groaned, the snow piled thick, but inside the two of them sat by the fire making lists. Plans, places to go, people to find, names to clear, names to expose. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were a reckoning. A month later, they passed through a town called Larch Hill, small, quiet, halfway between nothing and nowhere. They took shelter in a barn behind the church. The preacher was an old woman named Ruth, who didn't ask questions but brought food anyway. She said she'd heard rumors of a mountain man and a boy with fire in his eyes, and figured they might need warmth more than prayers. Gideon liked her immediately. They stayed 2 nights. Josiah sat with the children during Sunday sermon. He didn't speak, just listened. And afterward, one of the children, a boy with one eye and a crooked leg, followed him out to the porch and whispered, "Are you the one who burned Red Hollow?" Josiah didn't flinch. "Yes." The boy nodded, "Thank you." They left the next morning. The preacher handed them a small box wrapped in cloth. Inside was a locket. "I found it near the church fence after the fire last spring," she said. "Didn't know what to do with it, but something told me it belonged to you." Josiah opened it slowly. Inside was a lock of hair, black as coal, pressed flat and tied with a red thread. He closed the box without a word. Over the months that followed, they lit fires across the territory. In Cold Brook, they uncovered a rail agent running a child smuggling ring through telegraph stations. In Hayden's Hollow, they exposed a wealthy widow buying girls from orphan trains and branding them as maids. In Harrow Ridge, they broke open a boarding school that had buried 10 children beneath a greenhouse. Each time, Gideon would stand beside Josiah as they faced down rifles and walls and men who thought fear was armor. And each time, Josiah would say the same words before the fire took the paper. "You don't own them anymore." The children they rescued didn't all stay. Some returned to what remained of their families. Some chose different names. Some didn't speak at all, but each of them left with a wooden carving, a bear, a wolf, a bird, and a promise. that they were not forgotten, that someone still walked the wilds, looking for their lost. One night, deep in the heart of the Bitterroot Range, Gideon and Josiah made camp under a shattered sky. The stars hung low and bright, and the wind was warm for the first time in weeks. Josiah sat whittling beside the fire. "You think it'll ever stop?" he asked. "The fires. The taking." Gideon stared into the coals. "Not unless someone keeps standing up." Josiah turned the carving in his hand. "Then we keep standing." Gideon looked at him. The boy he'd carried through the storm was gone. In his place stood a man, scarred, strong, and still burning with the quiet fury of someone who'd lost too much to ever stand still. He reached into his coat and pulled out a new carving. An eagle. Wings wide, head high. He handed it to Josiah. "You carry this one now," he said. Josiah ran his fingers over the feathers. "What's it for?" he asked. Gideon stared into the trees. "For what comes next." Years later, stories would spread of two figures moving through the frontier like ghosts. A man with a beard like mountain frost, and a younger shadow beside him, quieter, sharper, always watching. They didn't stay in towns, didn't answer to lawmen, but wherever they passed, children vanished from chains, crooked schools went up in flames, and names carved into ledgers were crossed out for good. Some called them outlaws. Others called them saints. But those who truly knew, those who still bore the scars, called them by a different name. Family.